What if a single phone call could shake decades of foreign policy? That is what just happened between Australia's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu. In a move that stunned global observers, Albanese publicly accused Netanyahu of being, quote, in denial about Gaza's deepening humanitarian catastrophe. This came right after a tense conversation between the two leaders, with Albanese revealing his frustration over Israel's ongoing military escalation and the mounting civilian suffering. The world took notice. For the first time ever, Australia will officially recognize a Palestinian state at the United Nations next month. This is not just another twist in the old Israel-Palestine debate. Australia has been a reliable U.S. ally and a voice of caution in Middle East affairs for decades. So why now? And why so public? The answer goes beyond one leader's words. Weeks of mass protests in Australian cities, political pressure from within the government, and growing outrage over Gaza shaped a new direction. Even as Netanyahu defended his approach and blasted Australia's stance as shameful, Albanese doubled down, calling Israel's actions a block to any two-state solution and insisting on the world stage that enough is enough. If we underestimate moments like these, we risk missing how fast global alliances and international policies can shift, changing the future of diplomacy, humanitarian aid, and even the credibility of Western unity. How did Australia's approach shift from careful diplomacy to outright confrontation with a close ally? For decades, Australia played it safe on Israel and Palestine, never rocking the boat. So what changed? Australia has always prided itself on being a steady, reliable ally of the West. When it comes to the Middle East, that has meant following the lead of countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, rarely criticizing Israel directly, and keeping diplomatic statements bland and careful. Even as conflicts flared and the world debated, Canberra's official line was cautious, emphasizing restraint and the need for dialogue, but stopping well short of calling out Israeli policies in public. This caution wasn't accidental. It was a strategy built on decades of alliance politics. Australian governments of both major parties have traditionally avoided open confrontation with Israel, fearing diplomatic backlash or a break with powerful friends. When international crises erupted, whether in Gaza or the West Bank, Australia's stance was almost always predictable: express concern, urge for peace, and move on. But as the humanitarian crisis in Gaza deepened, that old formula started to crack. Graphic reports of civilian casualties and a mounting humanitarian catastrophe began to dominate headlines and social media feeds in Australia. Public frustration boiled over, with pro-Palestinian protests drawing massive crowds. On one Sunday, more than 90,000 people marched across the Sydney Harbour Bridge demanding urgent action and statehood recognition for Palestine. These protests were not just noise on the streets. They reflected a growing tide of anger inside Australia's parliament and among voters who saw the government's passion as complicity. Politicians, activists, and ordinary citizens began pressuring Prime Minister Anthony Albanese for a clear stand, especially as Israel's military escalated its campaign in Gaza and humanitarian conditions worsened. Yet even with all this pressure, Canberra's official statements remained measured, until a single conversation changed everything. In a dramatic shift from tradition, Prime Minister Albanese publicly accused Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu of being, quote, in denial about the suffering in Gaza. This wasn't just strong language for an Australian leader, it was unprecedented, marking a sharp departure from decades of careful, quiet diplomacy. Understanding this context is crucial. Ignoring how rare and risky this move was risks missing the real story. Australia's break from its own tradition signals a major shift in global diplomatic signals, and it could reshape alliances far beyond the Middle East. But what could possibly push a leader to upend decades of foreign policy in one phone call? The answer lies in what happened next. Let's unpack the explosive conversation between Albanese and Netanyahu, and why it forced Australia's hand. Why did a single phone call between two world leaders spark a crisis that could rewrite decades of foreign policy? If you miss this turning point, you risk misunderstanding how quickly alliances and the fate of entire nations can change. Behind closed doors, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese held what he called a long conversation with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. But this was not just another diplomatic chat. The world was watching as civilian deaths in Gaza soared, outrage erupted in cities across Australia, and pressure mounted on both leaders to act. During the call, Albanese pressed Netanyahu about the deepening humanitarian disaster, what he described as a cycle of violence and a catastrophe stretching back almost 2 years. But instead of dialogue, Albanese encountered a wall. Netanyahu, according to Albanese, would not even acknowledge the scale of civilian suffering. With frustration boiling over, Albanese went public. He leveled a rare accusation, declaring Netanyahu in denial about the Gaza crisis, an unprecedented move, given Australia's long record of careful, balanced engagement in the Middle East. This was more than a diplomatic spat. It was a calculated warning.
Albanese warned, the Israeli government is extinguishing the prospect of a two-state solution with actions in Gaza. The message was clear. As the violence continued, the hope for any political solution was slipping away, and Australia was no longer willing to stand quietly on the sidelines.
Then came a move that stunned observers. Days later, Albanese announced that, for the first time ever, Australia would officially support the recognition of a Palestinian state at the United Nations. This was not just a shift in policy, it was a direct rebuke, triggered by Netanyahu's refusal to address Gaza's suffering, mounting domestic pressure, and growing unrest within Albanese's own government. For decades, Australia had walked a fine line, rarely confronting Israel so openly. But the mounting civilian toll, Netanyahu's hardline stance, and that fraught phone call pushed Albanese over the edge. His charge of denial was more than rhetoric. It was a signal that global patience had snapped. This showdown exposed how frustration, transparency, and public fury can shatter long-standing alliances overnight. When leaders refuse to confront painful truths, humanitarian disasters worsen, and nations risk losing their moral standing in the eyes of the world. For Australia, breaking the silence was the only way to avoid being complicit. The fallout was swift, and the global repercussions are just beginning to unfold. But what exactly did Albanese risk by making such a public stand? And how did the world react? Let's break down the immediate consequences and why they matter now more than ever. Did Australia just gamble its global standing for a cause, or trigger a backlash that could haunt its future? If you tune out now, you risk missing how a single move can redraw alliances and tilt the scales of power worldwide. With a single accusation, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese declaring Benjamin Netanyahu in denial over Gaza's suffering, paired with recognizing Palestinian statehood, Australia ignited a diplomatic explosion. Israel's prime minister swiftly condemned the move as shameful, warning it would endanger Israel's security. Suddenly, the reliable partnership between Canberra and Jerusalem teetered on the brink, with years of trust hanging in the balance. Australia's decision sent shockwaves far beyond the Middle East. Domestically, the reaction was electric. Opposition parties vowed to reverse Palestinian recognition if they regained power, exposing deep political fractures and risking a cycle of policy whiplash. Meanwhile, for pro-Palestinian voices and a significant portion of the Australian public, Albanese's action became a rallying point, a sign Australia could lead, not just follow. Globally, the aftershocks have been undeniable. Some Western allies, like France, indicated they might follow Australia's example, with President Emmanuel Macron calling Netanyahu's vision for Gaza a disaster waiting to happen. The leadership in New Zealand asserted that Palestinian recognition was a matter of when, not if. Australia positioned itself as part of a bold new coalition, aiming to revive the two-state solution and disrupt the cycle of violence that has persisted for generations. But Australia's pivot comes with steep risks. By stepping out of alignment with traditional partners, Canberra faces possible diplomatic isolation or even punitive retaliation, not only from Israel, but from Western allies wary of breaking consensus. Yet, if Australia's gamble pays off, it could recast the nation as a trailblazer, inspiring a cascade of similar policy shifts across the West and changing its international profile for decades. Beneath the headlines, this episode has laid bare the fragility of global alliances and the power of domestic pressure to drive foreign policy. Australia's move has forced other Western leaders to confront their own stances, proving that public sentiment can upend even the most entrenched diplomatic doctrines. Whether this sparks a domino effect or a fierce backlash, one thing is certain. Australia's voice now rings louder in the halls of world diplomacy, and the outcome could redefine the roles for everyone watching. But what happens next? Let's break down the immediate fallout and the unpredictable twists no one saw coming. This wasn't just about leaders. It was about public pressure and political will. What happened in Australia shows that even long-standing government policies can be upended when citizens and activists refuse to stay silent. For weeks, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's own cabinet and thousands of pro-Palestinian voices across the country urged him to act, creating a wave that could not be ignored. Behind closed doors, Albanese's government faced mounting frustration not only from within, but also from a public outraged by the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Protests filled the streets, and members of parliament pushed for stronger action. This pressure reached a tipping point and ultimately led Australia to recognize Palestinian statehood, a move the government described as part of a coordinated international effort, not an isolated gesture. Why does this matter? Because it proves that activism and open debate can deliver real-world shifts in national policy, even on issues many thought were set in stone. As Albanese himself said, recognizing Palestine was meant to send a message to end the cycle of violence. The lesson is clear. Collective voices and the courage of leaders to listen and act can break through decades of diplomatic inertia. Understanding how public opinion, political courage, and global momentum interact gives all of us a powerful tool. It means everyday people can influence not just the headlines, but the future direction of their own country and the wider world. But what does this bold move mean for Australia's relationships abroad? And could it inspire similar changes in other countries? Let's look at the global ripple effects next. Australia's break with tradition wasn't inevitable. Are you watching for the next policy earthquake? This week, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese declared that Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu is in denial about Gaza's humanitarian catastrophe. For decades, Australia has walked a cautious line in Middle East policy, rarely confronting its Western allies or challenging the status quo. But now, after months of mounting frustration and public outcry, the government has announced it will recognize Palestinian statehood at the United Nations next month, a first in Australian history. What forced this seismic change? Not just the horrors unfolding in Gaza, but also relentless pressure from activists, public protests with tens of thousands on the streets, and voices from within Albanese's own cabinet. Behind closed doors, Australia's leaders realized that silence was no longer an option if they wanted to retain credibility with their voters and with the wider world. This episode is a textbook example of how international frustration can crack open old alliances and spark new diplomatic realities. The levers of change often move quietly until they become impossible to ignore. If you only pay attention to headlines after the fact, you'll miss the deeper signals that reveal where the world is truly heading. In today's fast-shifting landscape, only those who spot these moments early will understand the future of global power. Australia's choice didn't happen overnight, and the next diplomatic earthquake may be building right now, somewhere else.
So how do you recognize the signs of a coming geopolitical shift before it hits the headlines? Let's break down what to watch for, no matter where you live.